Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Rose to the Ceilings podcast. And today we have a guest with us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, will do. My name is Carmela Montenegro. I am a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant for the outdoor industry. I am based out of Keystone, Colorado, the heart of ski industry America, as some people call it. I've been doing this since 2017. My background is in outdoor education. And when I got started in my undergrad, I originally went to school for music education. Thought, okay, this probably isn't it for me. Somehow ended a job in outdoor education, started noticing that I was one of the few people of color, one of the few women of color, nonetheless. Started talking about it. When I started doing that, I took a break, finished up my marketing degree, worked as a freelancer for a little bit, for probably like 2 years, and then I went back to DEI when I moved out here in Colorado. And a lot of people were recognizing me, understanding my story, and I thought, I could do this as a career. And here I am now talking to Isabella and Maggie about my experiences.
Yeah.
So, you
Um,
mentioned that there's not a lot of people of color or women in the field or in the outdoor consulting field. Why do you think that is? Pretty curious about that.
Oh yeah, it's so I can talk a little bit about the history, especially within America. I know a bit about the national parks history when we're looking at the unit or within America. So let me think. I'll go as far back as possible for it to start making sense. So there has been. I'm just gonna. I'm just gonna tell the story based on the assumption that people don't know about the history of slavery in the United States. So historically, when we're talking about the creation of the outdoors, conservation, trail work, national parks, a lot of that was considered dirty work. So um, before before the Civil War, early days Civil War, it was considered dirty work. So a lot of black people, a lot of Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants, and were forced to work on trail works as a result of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was best friends with John Muir. John Muir started exploring the outdoors, especially when we were traveling from east to west in the United States. And a lot of the context of what John Muir said to Franklin Delano Roosevelt said the indigenous people, he called them the savages are dirty and they are meant to be pushed away, essentially. Um, so that kind of set the precedent of what conservation was meant to look like in the United States. Is that mentality, especially since John Muir founded or was one the founders of, I believe it's the Sierra Club, and it's one of the most profound nonprofits when we talk about trail work and conservation in the United States. And he also made the quote, "The mountains are calling, and I must go." And a lot of people have revered John Muir's admiration for the outdoors and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's adoration for the outdoors as well. And that kind of set the precedent of the kind of culture leading up into the outdoor industry. Um, Colorado, for example, has its own racist history. When we're talking about um, like Heritage Days out here in Colorado, I live about an hour and a half up from Denver, about an hour from Golden and Boulder, which are really profound areas when we're talking about rock climbing, rafting, and mountain biking. Um, when we talk about history and heritage days, it suddenly starts in the gold rush. No one knows about the indigenous history here. No one knows about the history of the KKK and purging of the indigenous people and brown people to essentially create these roads and these tracks that help people get up here. So that history was essentially erased. And that also sets the precedent of um, what kind of culture is welcome here without without sharing the history of the people of color and that kind of acknowledgement, it makes it a lot harder for the outdoor industry to move on and create a more diverse industry. There's a lot of historical context that happened in the mid 1850s or 1800s, excuse me, to probably like the 1970s, 80s. Um, that make it challenging for the outdoor industry to be very diverse. And now we're seeing a shift as the pandemic has happened, and we're understanding that the outdoor industry is, in my opinion, is reaching a financial peak. So I think the outdoor industry impacted about $1.3 trillion into the U.S. economy, and we're either hitting that peak or we're hitting that early economic peak. But we're understanding that without diversity representation and accommodating for unique people, we're going to start plateauing about, I think the statistic is by year 2042,
Wow.
2046, in the United States. So I think it's really important to understand, like, the outdoor industry has historically been harmful to people of color, people of physical disabilities, mental disabilities, with erasing certain parts of history. And now there's a lot of opportunity and desire to want to change that because there's a lot at risk. Conservation, like zoos, zoos are a little messed up, but you can't really create a marine biologist without going to a zoo. Like, the correlation there is very high. So gotta get more people outdoors to really start being passionate about the outdoors. I rambled a
Um,
lot there, but that's a quick history.
just to clarify for those of us who are still a little lost, what exactly does the
Yeah.
outdoor industry like entail? Like, what exactly does
hmm
like it kind of like what is it composed of?
hmm Yeah. So traditionally, it's gonna be a lot of adrenaline work. So that's the part of the outdoor industry that I focus on, like mountain biking, whitewater rafting, skiing, trail running, uh, backpacking for like months on end. That's the part of the outdoor industry that is more traditional. In the last, like, I don't know, like 10, 20 years, the more modern version of the outdoor industry includes like car camping, trail hiking, like casual trail hiking for like 1 to 3 miles, taking your dog on a walk, more like half day activities. Whereas in the past, well, actually, in the past year, literally in the United States, this is why the GDP is so high. The outdoor industry also includes certain restaurants that directly cater to the outdoor industry. So, like the restaurant at the ski resort, for example. Skateboarding is now part of the outdoor industry now. Um, RVing is expanding to be a more intimate part of the outdoor industry. And what else is really interesting? Um, and picnicking. Picnicking has Picnicking and like recreating in local parks
Interesting.
has is really important in the outdoor industry, because so it's changed in intensity. It's not like you have to go mountain biking for like 5 days straight for it to be an outdoor activity anymore. It could be like picnicking and hanging out the park and spending money on the ice cream man. Like, that's the outdoor industry now. Um, so depends on who you talk to ultimately. If you're spending time outdoors, you're spending money, and you're like hanging out with people, I think that's the outdoor industry. And then there's some purists that are like, oh no, you have to be like backpacking and you don't have to have your phone for like 5 months. Like, things are changing. So that's the economic definition of the outdoor industry, kind of.
Yeah, I had no idea that just spending time outdoors is contributing to the United States economy that much. But now that
hmm
I mean that now that you think about it, if you're buying things for a picnic or if you're buying, like you said, a restaurant at a ski trip, it kind of makes sense. But also, almost everything you said about history was new to me, and that's weird because I think Isabel will relate to this. Right now in school, we're learning about FDR and his New Deal stuff and his like outdoor policies. I'm like, oh, none of this was brought up. None of their talk about how they treated people of color were brought up. So I think it's really strange how, like you mentioned, outdoor industry is majorly contributing to the GDP, but is I didn't even know what it was barely talked about. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it was. So I'm also getting more involved with local government here. Um, So part of the reason we suspect why the outdoor industry isn't frequently talked about is because of our limited representation within the government. So what is it, like five, as of the end of last year, there are 5 states with a department, an office of recreation, something like that, within the United States. And there wasn't enough involvement within state government and federal government. And also, people look at outdoor recreation as a hobby, as a lifestyle. The reason I mentioned that is because I want to juxtapose it against, like, healthcare, for example. Healthcare in the United States, pretty messed up. Um, and it directly impacts livelihoods in the United States. But economically, as of the beginning of this year, end of last year, when we're comparing GDP, the outdoor industry now has more economic benefit into national GDP than um, insurance and healthcare now. So there is a lot of opportunity for the outdoor industry to make a bigger impact because of its correlation with healthcare. We're just trying to figure out how. But again, to ultimately answer your question, I think it's because the outdoor industry has been historically viewed as recreation, as a hobby, as something optional, which isn't as important as healthcare and insurance.
For sure.
Hopefully that
That's a
answers
little
that.
strange to me too. Like I think that like a capitalist government would be like, oh, this is making a lot of money. We should really put this in the spotlight. So I'm like surprised that hasn't happened. But it makes sense that the outdoors industry, like as you mentioned, it's not seen as seriously. I'm kind of like confused on that too, because like healthcare, like you said, healthcare and getting activity and go hand in hand. Like you can't really be healthy without that type of recreation, I feel. So I'm just curious there too. Like, how come? Is it that they are aware of the outdoors industry, like the government? Are they aware of it, but they just don't take it seriously, or just has no one bothered to make them aware?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think I'm gonna go with the latter, that no one has really taken the outdoor industry as seriously. There has been a lot of push in the last 2, 3-ish years for the outdoor industry to be taken more seriously because um, previously I'd mentioned economically we had not considered like skateboarding, we had not considered restaurants at the base of ski resorts, like those were not considered. But when we reevaluated the outdoor industry, we're like, okay, this is more serious than we thought. Um, there are people that will go to where I live out here in Keystone, Colorado, for the sake of skiing. And what is it? The average 4-person family over winter break will spend anywhere between $3,000 to $12,000 for a few day trip. Like that's a big economic push. Whereas ski lift tickets are anywhere between $150 to $300 a day per person. So that's like that starts adding up, and how much money you put back um, into the food industry, into local retail. Um, so they're understanding that ripple effect a little bit more. And I think that's why they're taking it more seriously, because where I live, without the sense of tourism, this economy would be totally bust if we relied solely on ski resort tickets. Um, it's wildly expensive, but if they didn't spend money elsewhere around here, I I wouldn't have a job. My friends wouldn't have jobs here. It's understanding the repercussions again of being here.
We feel that for sure. Where me and Isabella are based, we're in British Columbia. We have a lot of pretty popular mountains. I know Whistler in the past few years has gotten really popular. People have been talking about how crowded it is now. So yeah, I think it's obvious to almost anyone who lives in this area how much like tourism that's ski mountain, like a single ski mountain alone brings in. So I totally understand what you mean by like how many jobs are just solely based on. We have friends who work on that mountain just because of how popular it is now. For sure.
Oh
But
yeah.
to go a bit
Oh yeah.
back on what you're saying about your DEI job in the outdoors industry, were there like always DEI jobs in the outdoors industry, or is this like a super recent thing that's popped up?
Ooh, diversity, equity, inclusion work has existed probably since affirmative action in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s. If I don't remember the dates on that, but like that's essentially the inception of diversity, equity, inclusion. And there have been consultants for that. But for the outdoor industry, I don't know anybody, I don't know any DEI consultant that's been doing it longer than probably 9 years.
Mm.
Um, so it's relatively new. I am probably one of the youngest DEI consultants that I know out there, mainly because a lot of DEI consultants, they were like HR directors, VP of people for, I don't know, like 10, 20 years, head of education, like job titles like that. Before they got into DEI, and it was not really stable as a career choice until COVID happened. And George Floyd happened. For those who are not familiar with George Floyd, he was a black man in the Minneapolis area who essentially got choked up by a police officer, and um, it inspired a lot of riots in the United States during the summer of 2020. And a lot of companies took that seriously. Um, so it's relatively new, but it's not. It hasn't started with me. I am probably one of the few people who will talk to like the ski industry, mountain biking, rafting communities that focus more on that heavy adrenaline and have more ingrained roots into, my opinion, harder roots into white supremacy. Um, uh, because of that, more intimate relationship with the land that you need, that is easier to access when you're white. Um, So I, in that very specific niche, I'm probably one of the very few people I can count of, like me and like two other DEI consultants that'll touch that part of the industry.
So since DEI consultation in the outdoor industry is so new, it's only been around for like 9 years, as you said, do you think there's a reason that it's becoming more needed, or do you think it's just now that people are starting to be aware that it's needed?
A little, people are starting to understand that it is being needed. Um, so let's see. Um, so the outdoor industry reports, it's essentially like an economic report, but just for the outdoor industry. And they release a report one or two times a year, depending on the year. And a lot of them noticed that the report, starting from the year 2019, I believe, noticed that started doing reports on outdoor involvement by race and ethnicity. Um, and they were noticing that um, the involvement between like black individuals, Asian American individuals, um, were starting to decrease, whereas Hispanic individuals were slowly increasing. Um, and there was a note on the side that says, well, I'm paraphrasing right now. It essentially said if we keep on this trajectory, we're going to see a decrease in the outdoor industry by like 2042. I want to say it's 2042. Anyway, it's going to happen in the next like 20, 30 years. I keep seeing different numbers. So that kind of woke up the outdoor industry a little bit. And there are a lot of, especially when you're working with rafting companies, mountain biking companies, and ski in within the ski industry, you get a lot of waivers saying like, okay, if you feel unsafe, this is on you, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of insurance. But it's so expensive to get sued, and there are a lot of companies in the outdoor industry that are getting sued for defamation, racist behaviors, discrimination, and it's becoming more inherent as there are problematic employees rising to the ranks and in essentially, I guess, uh, continuing this harmful behavior throughout their employees, and it's also impacting their clientele. And when I talked to the rafting industry last month when I was at a conference, there were several lawsuits that happened because of discrimination. And they're like, okay, we need to talk to a DEI consultant, we need to talk to a legal officer, we need to talk to another consultant. And that's one area that is noticing like they need uh, to prevent this, because getting sued is very expensive. Um, in the United States, they'll like try and get you for all your money. I've heard of a couple of companies that got sued and they had to shut down because they were sued for so much money. And um, it's a pretty big deal in the United States. Um, and yeah, those are some financial reasons why it's important in the outdoor industry to take seriously.
You also mentioned how a lot of the people you know who work as a DEI consultant now kind of started in like HR jobs. Are you able to elaborate on a bit more about the difference between just like regular HR and being a DEI consultant?
Yeah, yeah. So most companies will have like different titles. I'm gonna choose. Let's use Dannon for example. I have a friend who is VP of Learning and Development. There's like learning and development, there's employee engagement, there's human resources, there's people operations. Those are close, but not exactly the same. Like they're cousins, I guess is the best way I can put it. Human resources, in the best way, I'm gonna explain this very broadly. Human resources is more like policy. Like Dannon has all four of those roles. Learning and development is making sure that everybody stays up to date on training, making sure that teams are getting supported um, as they learn. People operations mostly helps with like onboarding, offboarding, and kind of helps is kind of that in between with learning and development. Um, I don't know about Dannon, but that's generally how the tech companies go. And then diversity, equity, inclusion. So what I do and what other DEI people within companies do, they essentially take data within companies. They're like, okay, our company is like 12%. 12% of our company identifies as black. What do we do that? What is our retention? What can we do to update that? Are there specific trainings? Are there managers that I need to talk to make sure we can increase these numbers or maintain these numbers? What are our priorities? It's a lot of managing and overviewing a lot of leaders in the company to make sure that we're staying diverse, but also that they're being heard. And one way they do that is to look at innovation of ideas, for example. Um, Psychological safety, there's ways to test for that within companies, and making sure or and challenging policies that could be harmful, for example. Um, I know companies that are more lenient on like being late to interviews or meetings if you have a kid, for example, or you're a new parent. Um, so those are just some examples of what a DEI person would do within a company.
Sure, that's all really interesting. Um,
Mhm.
could you expand a little bit more about the psychological safety bit of it? I'm really interested on
Mhm.
whatever that means.
Yeah, psychological safety is a relatively new concept. Professor Dr. Amy Edmondson of Harvard University started researching this in like 1992, 94, something like that. And she's been researching it throughout the 90s and released a book in like, I don't know, like 2008. I don't remember. Um, it's a really big book. I audiobook through the whole thing. But essentially, the concept of psychological safety is, do you feel safe at work? Do you feel safe taking risks? Do you have a good relationship with your manager to be able to take these risks? And do you have a good relationship with your peers, colleagues, teammates, interns, anyone below you to be able to take these risks? Um, that's the biggest concept in that book is, do you feel safe to take risks? Um, and I think it's really important to measure that when we're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, because there's a lot of pushback, um, particularly within diverse individuals, when they want to share different ideas.
So
And
you mentioned that you could test this. I'm a little
mhm,
bit curious, like how you would go about that typically.
yeah, psychological safety. So at the beginning of this, I talked a little bit about um, questions I would ask and assess. Well, actually, we said this pre-recording when we were just hanging out in here. Um, so I did this with a client last year, and some questions we had. Do you feel safe taking risks with your manager? Do you feel safe speaking up against your teammates? Um, have any of your ideas been executed in the last 2 years or during your time with us together? Those are just an example of some questions that we could ask to test psychological safety. Um, the biggest difference when you're testing for psychological safety, and I have a background in market research, I have a marketing degree with a specialty in market research, is to understand, okay, do you feel safe? And that's the optimistic side. When we're looking at the truth, we have to look historically. Have any ideas been executed? Have you spoken up previously about potentially harmful circumstance? So that'll so there's optimism again, and then there's the historical context, and then you test them against each other, and you test those against your identity and what your peers also feel, and if there's any discoloration essentially between you and a colleague that has a different identity from you, then there's going to be a red flag from me as the consultant. And that's how we test for
Um,
psychological safety.
just a question. Let's say a workplace is found. There's a lot of people who feel psychologically unsafe. What would the next step be?
Yeah, so every consultant or internal person will manage it a little bit differently. I So what I do is I work with the HR person and figure out if there could be a PIP, so professional improvement plan for that employee. So can we put them through coaching? Should they work with me one on one? I think when you're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion work, it's important to figure out if there's a way to hold that person accountable. Otherwise, the harm is going to keep happening. Other consultants, they'll they'll have that, they'll assess, they'll push the department through a ton of training, see if that fixes it. Work with the aggressor and keep going through trainings and figure out if there's a way to go through the team side instead of just going individually. Um, I know there's a couple conservation nonprofits that will simply put the employee on a PIP plan. If they have an infraction of one or two incidences, they're automatically fired. They're pretty strict about that. So it ultimately depends on if we're going to go technical, the relationship I have with the organization, what's within my contract, and the relationship I have with the employment officer or legal officer to figure out what I can do um, that stays within the employment contract that they placed for me and for the aggressing employee. Um, because usually it's there's going to be one key employee that's going to be leading that whole incident, and if there's multiple employees, we figure it out once we take care of the core problem.
Yeah, that
More
definitely
technical.
makes more sense. Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, of course.
I think to wrap us up, I would just like to say that there are definitely a lot of high school girls watching in our audience who might be thinking about what career they want to go towards. So, for some people who might be thinking of a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or maybe in the outdoor industry, would you have any advice for some steps towards this?
Yeah. For the outdoor industry, um, don't go to college for it, in my opinion. Get internships, work as a raft guide, work at Whistler and move yourself up. I think like the outdoor industry, you got to learn it to really go up. There's going to be a natural plateau. Maybe you consider going to college when you hit that plateau, but like the outdoor industry is just fooling around and you get paid for it. Um, for diversity, equity, inclusion, it's definitely getting more competitive out there since 2020. I would say shadow or intern for a DEI consultant. Really push in there because DEI consultants are really picky, especially since there's a lot of legal liability. That's why I haven't hired an intern or a part time person to support me, is because of that legal liability. But if you can build their trust, you can probably get an intern or learn from them. But if anything, start building your start building that rapport. I don't have the experience. I'm going to be frank with you. I don't have the experience like other DEI consultants. I'm only 29 years old. Most of my background is in outdoor education and retail and outfitting. And I'm just really good at selling. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm really good at pitching and selling. Um, but if you're not as confident as I am for selling, um, really work your way up, really make those connections. Because half of the people that have hired me are people that I've met and know that I am very confident when I speak. Um, but yeah, go to school. I would say go to school, um, manage a team, figure out how people work, understand that social psychology, and figure out what you want to specialize in. I know people that work in conservation. Mine is more in workforce diversity and policy, especially for, again, like the more adrenaline based outdoor part of the industry. Whereas some people like, again, conservation, water resourcing. Um, a lot of people focus on different things. Some consultants just do trainings. So figure out what you enjoy, fall into that niche, and just go hard on that.
Awesome. Thank
Thank
you
you so
so much.
much.
We learned so much today.
Yeah,
So
of
much.
course.
Thank you.
Thank you.